The dusty streets of Tonopah, Nevada, held secrets that only a man with sharp eyes could catch, and Yale Brennan had learned to see everything in his 26 years of living rough and riding hard across the Western Territories. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the silver mining town in the summer of 1887, and Yale watched from across the street as a young woman in a faded calico dress quietly passed her wrapped lunch to a gaunt prospector slumped against the mercantile wall, his clothes hanging loose on his frame like fabric draped over bones. She smiled at the old man, patted his shoulder with genuine kindness, and walked away with nothing in her hands and an empty stomach that she probably thought nobody would notice. Yale had noticed. He had been leaning against the hitching post outside the Silver Queen Saloon, rolling a cigarette and minding his own business after 3 weeks of driving cattle from California to the railroad depot in Reno. His pockets held decent money for once. His horse was well fed and rested at the livery, and he had been contemplating whether to spend the night in a real bed or save his earnings for the ranch he dreamed of owning someday. The decision became remarkably simple the moment he saw that act of selfless compassion. Yale crushed the unlit cigarette in his palm and crossed the sun-baked street with long, purposeful strides. His spurs jingled softly with each step, the sound almost musical against the backdrop of distant mine whistles and the ever-present wind that swept through the Nevada desert. The young woman had paused at the corner, one hand pressed briefly to her stomach, before she straightened her spine and continued walking toward the small church at the edge of town. "Excuse me, miss," Yale called out, his voice carrying easily across the dusty gap between them. She turned, and Yale felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her face fully illuminated by the harsh desert light. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with honey-colored hair tucked beneath a simple bonnet, and eyes the color of sage leaves after a rare rain. Her features were delicate but determined, the kind of face that spoke of hardship, weathered with grace rather than bitterness. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, and her boots were worn through at the toes, but she held herself with quiet dignity. "Yes, sir?" Her voice was softer than Yale expected, but steady. Yale removed his hat, revealing dark hair that desperately needed cutting, and eyes the deep brown of good leather. "I happened to see what you did back there. That was a kind thing." A faint blush colored her cheeks, visible even through the dust and sun exposure that marked everyone who lived in this harsh climate. "I do not know what you mean." "The prospector," Yale said gently, nodding back toward the mercantile. "You gave him your food." Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach again, before she caught herself. "He needed it more than I did." "Maybe so," Yale agreed, taking a step closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "But that does not mean you need to go hungry. Now, let me feed you." Surprise flickered across her face, followed quickly by wariness. "I appreciate the offer, mister, but I cannot accept charity from strangers." "It's not charity," Yale said, and he found he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "Call it payment for restoring my faith that decent people still exist in this world. I have been on the trail for weeks, and I have seen more cruelty than kindness. What you did back there, giving away what was probably your only meal, that deserves to be acknowledged." She studied him carefully, those sage green eyes taking in the honest dust on his clothes, the worn but quality leather of his boots and gun belt, the weathered face of a man who worked hard for his living, but had not yet let the world make him mean. Whatever she saw must have satisfied some internal measure of judgment, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Georgia Sutton," she said finally, offering her hand in a gesture that was surprisingly forward for the times, but suited her independent bearing. Yale Brennan. His calloused hand engulfed hers, and he was careful to keep his grip gentle despite the jolt of electricity that seemed to pass between their palms. "There's a decent restaurant 2 streets over, run by a widow woman who makes the best stew this side of the Sierras. Would you do me the honor of joining me for supper?" Georgia hesitated, propriety warring with hunger, and perhaps something else, some spark of curiosity about this tall cowboy with kind eyes and an honest smile. "I should not," she said, but her conviction wavered. "Should not or do not want to?" Yale asked, then immediately wondered if he had pushed too hard. But something about this woman made him bold in ways he did not fully understand yet. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "Those are different things entirely, Mr. Brennan." "Yale," he corrected, And I'm hoping that means you want to, even if you think you should not. I am a school teacher, Georgia said, as if that explained everything. Or I was, until the school closed last month, when the mine owners decided education was not worth funding. I have been trying to find work, but positions are scarce, especially for women. People talk in small towns, and I cannot afford to damage my reputation. Yale understood immediately. A single woman dining alone with a man she had just met would indeed set tongues wagging, and in a place like Tonopah where everyone knew everyone else's business, such gossip could ruin what few prospects Georgia might have for employment or marriage. The fact that she had explained this to him, rather than simply walking away, told him she was tempted, and that knowledge warmed something in his chest that had been cold for far too long. "What if we ate at the widow's place, but sat at separate tables?" Yale suggested, thinking quickly. "You would be in a public establishment with proper supervision, and I would simply be a fellow customer who happened to recommend the restaurant. No one could fault you for that." Georgia's smile widened, and Yale felt absurdly proud of himself for putting that expression on her face. "You are determined, are you not?" "When something matters, yes," Yale said simply. "And I cannot explain why, but making sure you eat today matters to me." Something in his straightforward honesty seemed to reach her, because Georgia nodded once, decisively. "All right then, Mr. Brennan, I mean, Yale. Lead the way to this restaurant with the remarkable stew." They walked side by side through the dusty streets, not touching, but close enough that Yale could smell the faint scent of lavender water that Georgia must have used that morning. A brave attempt at freshness in a town where everything eventually surrendered to dust. He found himself adjusting his naturally long stride to match her shorter steps, and he told her about the cattle drive, about sleeping under stars so bright and numerous they looked like spilled salt across black velvet, about the way the herd moved like a single living organism when properly managed. Georgia listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that revealed a sharp mind and wide-ranging curiosity. In turn, she told him about her students, the children of miners and shopkeepers, and the few remaining ranchers who had not yet been driven out by the mining company's appetite for land and water. She spoke with passion about teaching a 10-year-old girl to read, about the way education could transform a life, about her frustration with a system that valued silver ore more than human potential. "My mother was a teacher," Georgia said as they neared the restaurant, a modest building with clean windows and cheerful blue shutters. "She taught me that education is the one thing no one can take from you once you have it. Even when you lose everything else, knowledge remains." "Sounds like a wise woman," Yale said. "Is she still teaching?" A shadow crossed Georgia's face. "She died 2 years ago. Fever took her in the space of a week. My father followed 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I think it was just broken beyond repair." Yale's hand moved instinctively toward hers, then stopped as he remembered where they were and who might be watching. "I am sorry for your losses." "Thank you." Georgia's voice was quiet but composed. She had clearly made her peace with grief, or at least learned to carry it without letting it crush her. They were good people who deserved longer lives, but we do not always get what we deserve in this world, do we? "No," Yale agreed, thinking of his own parents, dead in a Comanche raid when he was 15, of the years he had spent drifting from ranch to ranch with nothing but his horse and his skills with cattle. "We surely do not." Inside the restaurant, true to his word, Yale arranged for 2 separate tables. He chose one near the window, while Georgia sat closer to the kitchen, close enough that they could exchange occasional glances, but far enough apart that propriety was maintained. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who owned the establishment, gave Yale a knowing look that suggested she was not fooled by the arrangement, but appreciated the effort to maintain appearances. Yale ordered stew for himself, and when Mrs. Henderson came by George's table, he caught the widow's eye and mouthed, "Whatever she wants, put it on my bill." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face crinkled into a smile, and she nodded her understanding. He watched surreptitiously as Georgia ordered, noting how she asked for the day's special without inquiring about the price, a sure sign of someone accustomed to making do with whatever was available and cheapest. When Mrs. Henderson brought out not just stew, but fresh bread, butter, and a slice of apple pie, Georgia's eyes widened in surprise. She looked toward Yale's table, a question in her gaze, and he simply raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. The meal passed in a comfortable silence punctuated by the ordinary sounds of the restaurant. The the clink of spoons against bowls, the murmur of conversation from other diners, the sizzle of something cooking on the stove in the kitchen. Yale found himself barely tasting his own food, too focused on watching Georgia eat with the unconscious intensity of someone who had been skipping too many meals. She savored each bite, and he felt a fierce satisfaction at being able to provide this simple thing, a full stomach and a moment of peace. When they finished, Yale paid the bill and met Georgia outside, where the late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed to set the desert itself on fire. "Thank you," Georgia said simply. "That was the best meal I have had in longer than I care to admit." "It was my pleasure," Yale replied, and found himself reluctant to let this encounter end. "Will you be all right? Do you have a place to stay, enough to get by?" Georgia's chin lifted slightly, pride warring with pragmatism in her expression. "I have a room at the boarding house for another week. After that, I will need to find work or move on to another town where opportunities might be better." The thought of Georgia leaving Tonopah, of never seeing her again, struck Yale with unexpected force. He had known this woman for less than an hour, had shared nothing more than a meal and some conversation. Yet the idea of her disappearing from his life felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. "What kind of work are you looking for?" Yale asked. "Besides teaching, I mean." "Anything respectable," Georgia said with a pragmatic shrug. "I can sew, cook, clean, keep accounts. I am not afraid of hard work." An idea began forming in Yale's mind, reckless and impulsive, but feeling more right with each passing second. "What if I could help? I know some ranchers in the area, people who might need someone with your skills. Would you let me ask around?" Suspicion flickered in George's eyes, the natural wariness of someone who had learned that offers of help often came with strings attached. "Why would you do that for me? You do not know anything about me." "I know you gave your food to a hungry man," Yale said. "I know you worked as a teacher because you believe in education. I know you loved your parents and you carry your grief with grace. That is more than I know about most people I have worked with for months at a time." Georgia studied him for a long moment, and Yale met her gaze steadily, letting her see his sincerity. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If you hear of something, I would be grateful for the information. I am staying at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, the white one with the green trim on Silver Street." "I will find you," Yale promised. "Maybe tomorrow, if that suits you." "Tomorrow would be fine," Georgia agreed. Something warm flickered in her eyes, and Yale felt it answer in his own chest. "And Yale, thank you, not just for the meal, but for seeing me. It has been a long time since anyone really looked." She walked away before he could respond, her worn boots raising small puffs of dust with each step, and Yale stood watching until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then he headed straight for the Silver Queen Saloon, not for whiskey, but for information. If anyone in Tonopah knew who needed help and could afford to pay for it, it would be the men who gathered there each evening to drink and gamble away their day's earnings. The saloon was already filling with the usual evening crowd when Yale pushed through the swinging doors. Miners with silver dust still clinging to their clothes, ranch hands in for a rare night in town, gamblers and drifters, and the occasional businessman in a suit gone shiny at the elbows. Yale spotted a familiar face at the bar, Tom Crawford, foreman of the Double B Ranch about 10 miles outside of town. "Tom," Yale greeted, signaling the bartender for 2 beers. "Did not expect to see you here on a weekday." Tom was a solid man in his 40s, with the bow-legged walk of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on his feet. "Boss sent me in for supplies and to post a notice. We are looking for someone to help his wife with the household and the books. She has been managing everything herself since their last helper got married and moved to Carson City. But with the baby coming, she needs assistance." Yale felt destiny click into place like a key turning in a lock. "I might know someone. Woman I met today used to be the school teacher before the mine owners closed the school. Smart, responsible, good character." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You know her well enough to vouch for her after one day?" "I know enough," Yale said firmly. "Her name is Georgia Sutton. She is staying at Cooper's boarding house if you want to talk to her. But Tom, you make sure your boss and his wife treat her right, you understand? She has had a hard time of it lately, and she deserves fair wages and decent treatment." A slow grin spread across Tom's weathered face. "Well now, Yale Brennan concerned about a woman's welfare. Never thought I would see the day. You interested in her? Just met her, Yale protested, but he could feel heat rising in his face. That's not what I asked, Tom pointed out. But all right, I will keep my nose out of your business. I will talk to the boss tonight and ride by the boarding house tomorrow morning if he is interested. We pay fare at the Double B, and Mrs. Bennett is a kind woman. Your school teacher would be treated well. Relief flooded through Yale, mixed with an anticipation he had not felt in years. I appreciate it, Tom, truly. You sticking around Tonopah for a while? Tom asked. Or are you heading out on another drive? Yale had not given it much thought until that moment. His original plan had been to rest for a few days before heading south toward Arizona, where he had heard ranchers were hiring for a big trail drive to market. Good money, several months of work, exactly the kind of opportunity a man saving for his own spread should jump at. But Arizona suddenly seemed impossibly far away, and the idea of leaving Nevada held no appeal whatsoever. I might stay in the area for a bit, Yale said carefully. See if there is any work that needs doing. Tom's grin widened. Yeah, I bet you might. Tell you what, if you are looking for work, we could use an extra hand at the Double B. One of our regular boys broke his leg last week, and we are short-handed with Roundup coming. Pay is $30 a month, plus board. It was not the best money Yale had ever been offered, but it was steady work on a reputable ranch, and more importantly, it would keep him in the area, close to Georgia. The realization that he was making decisions based on a woman he had known for mere hours should have alarmed him, but instead, it felt like the first truly right choice he had made in a long time. I will take it, Yale said, shaking Tom's hand to seal the deal. When do you want me to start? Day after tomorrow? That gives you time to rest up and get your gear sorted. Yale nodded, already planning. Tomorrow he would find Georgia and tell her about the position at the Double B. If she got the job, they would be working at the same ranch, seeing each other regularly. The thought made him smile into his beer, and Tom laughed outright. You have got it bad, friend, Tom said cheerfully. Known the woman for one day and already rearranging your whole life. Maybe, Yale admitted. Or maybe I just recognize something worth staying for when I see it. That night, Yale paid for a room at the hotel rather than bunking in the livery as he usually did. He wanted to be fresh and presentable when he saw Georgia tomorrow. Wanted to appear as a man with prospects rather than a drifting cowboy. He lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Tonopah settling in for the night. Piano music drifting from the saloon, horses nickering in the livery, the distant whistle of the late train pulling into the depot. He thought about Georgia's smile, the way she had looked at the old prospector with compassion rather than disgust, the quiet strength in her voice when she spoke of her lost parents. He thought about the feel of her hand in his, small and work-roughened but warm. Somewhere in the space between meeting her and now, Yale's careful plans for the future had shifted to include a honey-haired schoolteacher with sage-green eyes, and the strangest part was that it did not feel strange at all. It felt inevitable, as if every trail he had ridden and every choice he had made had been leading him precisely here, to Tonopah, Nevada, in the summer of 1887, to a dusty street where a generous woman gave away her last meal. Morning came with the harsh brightness that characterized the Nevada desert, sunlight forcing its way through thin curtains and dragging Yale from sleep, filled with dreams of green eyes and soft smiles. He washed carefully in the basin provided, shaved away several days of stubble, and put on his cleanest shirt. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man he barely recognized, younger somehow, less weathered by the constant movement and solitude that had defined his adult life. The walk to Mrs. Cooper's boarding house took him through Tonopah's slowly waking streets. Shopkeepers were opening their establishments, sweeping away yesterday's accumulation of dust in a ritual that would be repeated tomorrow and all the days after. The Chinese laundry was already at work, steam rising from tubs of boiling water. A milk wagon rattled past, the driver nodding a greeting that Yale returned automatically. Mrs. Cooper's boarding house stood on a relatively quiet street, a well-maintained two-story structure that suggested its proprietor took pride in her establishment. Yale knocked on the door and waited, hat in hand, until a stern-faced woman in her 50s opened it and looked him up and down with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. Yes? Her tone was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply neutral. Good morning, madam. My name is Yale Brennan, and I am looking for Miss Georgia Sutton. I have some information about a job opportunity that might interest her. Mrs. Cooper's expression thawed slightly. "You are the cowboy who bought her dinner yesterday. She mentioned you." Yale felt absurdly pleased that Georgia had spoken of him. "Yes, madam. Is she available?" "Wait here." Mrs. Cooper closed the door firmly, leaving Yale standing on the porch feeling like a schoolboy called before the headmaster. Minutes passed, marked by the steady tick of his pocket watch, before the door opened again and Georgia appeared. She had changed into a different dress, still worn but clean and carefully mended, and her hair was caught up in a neat bun that exposed the graceful line of her neck. In the morning light, Yale could see faint freckles dusting her nose, could count the shades of gold and brown that made up her hair color. She was even prettier than he remembered, and he had to remind himself to breathe normally. "Yale," Georgia said, and he loved the way his name sounded in her voice. "Mrs. Cooper said you have news?" "I do," Yale confirmed, very aware that Mrs. Cooper was undoubtedly listening from just inside the house. "There is a position available at the Double B Ranch. The rancher's wife needs help with household duties and bookkeeping. The foreman, Tom Crawford, will be stopping by this morning to speak with you if you are interested." Hope flared bright in George's eyes before caution dampened it. "How did you arrange this so quickly?" "I did not arrange anything," Yale said honestly. "Tom happened to mention they were looking for someone, and I happen to know someone who might suit. The rest is up to you and the Bennetts." Georgia studied him, and Yale held still under her examination, letting her see whatever she needed to see. Finally, she smiled, and Yale felt his heart skip in his chest like a stone across water. "Thank you," Georgia said softly. "Even if nothing comes of it, thank you for thinking of me." "Always," Yale said, then wondered if that was too forward, too revealing of feelings that had no business being so strong so soon. But Georgia's smile only deepened, and color rose in her cheeks. "Will I see you again?" "Yes," Yale said firmly. "I took a job at the Double B myself, starting day after tomorrow, so if you get the position with the Bennetts, we will be on the same ranch." "Oh," Georgia said, and Yale could not tell if that single syllable held pleasure or concern or some mixture of both. "That is good to know." An awkward silence fell between them, the kind that happens when two people have much to say but no idea how to say it. Finally, Yale settled his hat back on his head and stepped back from the door. "I should go. Let you prepare for your meeting with Tom. But Georgia, I hope you get this job, not just because you need the work, but because I would very much like to see you again." "I would like that too," Georgia admitted, so quietly Yale almost missed it. "To see you again, I mean." Yale left the boarding house walking on air, his feet barely touching the dusty street. He spent the day taking care of practical matters, checking on his horse at the livery, purchasing supplies he would need for ranch work, getting his guns cleaned and his boots repaired. But his mind was elsewhere, with a honey-haired woman sitting in a boarding house parlor, hopefully impressing a ranch foreman with her intelligence and capability. He did not see Georgia again that day, though he found himself looking for her on every street, in every shop window. Evening found him back at the Silver Queen, nursing a single beer and playing a desultory hand of cards with some ranch hands he barely knew. He was considering turning in early when Tom Crawford pushed through the saloon doors and made a beeline for Yale's table. "Your schoolteacher is something else," Tom said without preamble, signaling for a whiskey. Smart as a whip, good with numbers, and Mrs. Bennett took to her immediately. "She starts tomorrow, room and board plus $20 a month." Relief and joy flooded through Yale in equal measure. $20 was not extravagant, but it was fair pay for a woman in 1887, and it would give Georgia stability and security. She took the position? Accepted on the spot once she saw the place and met Mrs. Bennett, Tom confirmed. "She will be moving out to the ranch tomorrow afternoon, which means you will both be there, living and working in the same place." Tom gave Yale a significant look. "You sure about this?" Could get complicated, mixing work and personal feelings. "I am sure," Yale said, more certain of this than he had been of anything in years. "This is right, Tom. I can feel it." Tom shook his head, but smiled. "Well then, I will see you both at the Double B. Try to get some work done in between making eyes at each other, will you?" Yale grinned, unashamed. "I will do my best." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Yale moved his few possessions out to the Double B, a prosperous operation with good grazing land, fed by a reliable creek, and well-maintained buildings that spoke of owners who valued quality. The main house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, with a wide porch and shutters painted white. The bunkhouse where Yale would sleep was clean and well ventilated, better than many places he had stayed. He met the other ranch hands, good men who accepted him easily once they learned he knew his way around cattle. He met Mr. Bennett, a fair-minded man in his early 40s who ran his ranch with efficiency and treated his workers with respect. And he met Mrs. Bennett, a cheerful woman whose pregnancy was just beginning to show, who talked excitedly about the help Georgia would provide. "Tom said you recommended her," Mrs. Bennett said to Yale, as she showed him where he would be working. "That was kind of you." "She is a good person who deserved a chance," Yale said simply. "Mrs.?" Bennett gave him a look that suggested she saw more than Yale intended to reveal. "Well, I am grateful you put us in touch. I have been struggling to keep up with everything, and my husband worries, though he tries to hide it." Late afternoon brought the rattle of wheels on the drive, and Yale's heart jumped into his throat. He forced himself to continue working, repairing a section of fence that had come loose, but his attention was fixed on the house where Georgia would be settling in. He caught a glimpse of her climbing down from the wagon, a battered trunk in the driver's hands, Mrs. Bennett greeting her warmly at the door. He did not see her again until supper, when the ranch hands gathered in the large dining room, attached to the bunkhouse for the evening meal. The Double B was one of those rare operations where the owners believed in feeding their workers well, understanding that good food meant better work. A long table dominated the room, already crowded with men talking and joking as they waited for the meal to be served. Then the door from the main house opened, and Georgia appeared carrying a large pot of stew. She had changed into a simple work dress with an apron, and her hair was caught back practically. But to Yale, she looked like something out of a dream. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and her face lit up with a smile meant just for him. The meal was excellent. Thick stew with vegetables and beef, fresh bread, strong coffee, and apple crisp for dessert. Georgia moved between the dining room and the kitchen, serving and clearing with quiet efficiency, but Yale felt her awareness of him just as he was constantly aware of her. Every time she passed near him, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken words and unexpressed feelings. After supper, when the men had cleared out and Yale had volunteered to help with the dishes despite the other hand's good-natured ribbing, he finally had a chance to speak with Georgia alone in the kitchen. "How was your first day?" he asked, taking up a dish towel while she washed plates in the large sink. "Good," Georgia said, her hands moving competently through the soapy water. "Mrs. Bennett is lovely, and the work is manageable. I have a nice room in the house, better than anywhere I have stayed in years. I still can hardly believe my good fortune." "You deserve good fortune," Yale said. "You deserve much more than that." Georgia turned to look at him, her hands still in the water. "You barely know me, Yale, yet you have shown me more kindness in 2 days than I have experienced in 2 years. Why?" It was a fair question, one Yale had been asking himself. The honest answer was complicated, involving instinct and attraction and some deeper recognition that he could not name. But he tried. "When I saw you give your food away, something in me recognized something in you," Yale said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I have spent years drifting, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, telling myself I was saving for a future that always seemed just out of reach. Then I saw you, this woman who had nothing but still gave what she had to someone who needed it more, and I realized I had been looking at life all wrong. Kindness like yours, that is what matters. That is what makes a place worth staying for." George's eyes had gone bright with unshed tears. "You stayed because of me?" "I stayed because of you," Yale confirmed. "And I know it is fast, probably too fast, and maybe I am out of line saying any of this. But I learned young that life is uncertain, and waiting for the perfect moment often means missing the real moment. So, yes, I stayed because I wanted to know you better, because something about you feels like coming home after a lifetime of wandering." A single tear traced down Georgia's cheek, and she lifted one soapy hand to wipe it away, leaving a smudge of bubbles on her face that made Yale smile despite the intensity of the moment. Without thinking, he reached out and gently wiped the soap away with his thumb, his touch lingering on her soft skin. "I felt it too," Georgia whispered. "When you stopped me on the street, when you offered to feed me, I felt something shift, like the world tilting just slightly, bringing things into better alignment. I thought I was being foolish, imagining connection where there was only kindness." "It was not only kindness," Yale said. "It was connection. It is connection." They stood close together in the quiet kitchen, the evening light slanting through the windows, painting everything in gold. Yale wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that made his hands shake, but he held back, aware that moving too fast could frighten her away. Instead, he simply looked at her, memorizing every detail of this moment. "We should take this slow," Georgia said, but her hand had found his where it rested on the counter, her fingers twining with his. "I have never been courted properly, never had time for romance. My parents' deaths, the need to work, everything has been about survival. I do not want to make foolish choices out of loneliness or gratitude." "I do not want you to either," Yale said, squeezing her hand gently. "So, we will take it slow. We will work together, talk when we can, learn about each other properly. And if what we both feel is real, it will still be there in a week, a month, a year." "A year is a long time," Georgia said, but she was smiling. "Not when you have found something worth waiting for," Yale replied. They finished the dishes together in comfortable silence, hands occasionally brushing, smiles exchanged like secret messages. When they were done, Yale walked Georgia to the main house, proper and respectful, bidding her good night on the porch where anyone could see. But the look they shared held promises that neither was quite ready to speak aloud. The days that followed established a rhythm that Yale came to treasure. He worked alongside the other hands, mending fences, moving cattle, breaking horses, doing all the demanding physical labor that ranching required. Georgia managed the Bennett household with quiet efficiency, keeping the books, helping with meals, taking some of the burden off the pregnant Mrs. Bennett's shoulders. But in the stolen moments between work, Yale and Georgia found each other, a conversation after breakfast before the day's work began, a shared glance across the supper table that spoke volumes, a walk in the evening, properly chaperoned by distance if not actual presence, talking about everything and nothing, while the desert sunset painted the sky in impossible colors. Yale learned that Georgia loved books, had read everything she could get her hands on, and mourned the loss of her small personal library sold to pay debts after her father's death. He learned that she had wanted to be a writer once, dreamed of stories that would transport readers to other worlds. He learned that she was afraid of snakes but fascinated by coyotes, that she could do complex mathematics in her head but could not carry a tune to save her life, that she believed in second chances and the fundamental goodness of people despite ample evidence to the contrary. Georgia learned that Yale had been orphaned young, had survived by his wits and his skill with horses. She learned that he dreamed of owning his own ranch someday, a place with good water and better grazing where he could build something permanent. She learned that he had a quiet sense of humor, a deep loyalty to those he cared about, and a simmering anger at injustice that he kept tightly controlled but never quite suppressed. They learned each other's histories and hopes, fears and dreams, all the small details that transform strangers into friends and friends into something more. 6 weeks after Georgia arrived at the Double B, Mrs. Bennett's baby came early, a son born healthy and squalling in the midst of a summer thunderstorm. Yale was in the barn when he heard the news, checking on a mare about to foal herself, and the sight of Mr. Bennett's joyful face as he announced his son's arrival stirred something deep in Yale's chest. He found himself imagining a future where he wore that same expression, where Georgia held their child and looked at him with love and contentment. The thought should have terrified him, commitment shy as he had always been. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Georgia was invaluable during Mrs. Bennett's recovery, taking over complete management of the household while the new mother rested and bonded with her baby. Yale watched her moving through the days with tireless energy, always competent, always kind, and fell more in love with each passing hour, because that was what this was, Yale finally admitted to himself. Love. Not infatuation, not mere attraction, but the real and lasting kind of love that made poets write sonnets and made sensible men do foolish things. He loved Georgia's strength and her gentleness, her sharp mind and her generous heart. He loved the way she laughed at his jokes and the way she argued with him about politics and philosophy. He loved her completely, and the knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. One evening in early September, as the worst of the summer heat began to break, Yale asked Georgia to walk with him after supper. They strolled away from the buildings toward a small rise that offered a view of the surrounding country. The sun was setting in its usual spectacular fashion, and the air smelled of sage and dust and the promise of cooler weather to come. Georgia, Yale began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain how to put his feelings into words that would do them justice. She looked at him with those sage green eyes, patient and questioning. Yes? I love you, Yale said simply, abandoning any attempt at eloquence in favor of plain truth. I have loved you since that first day in Tonopah, though I did not have the sense to recognize it immediately. I love you, and I need you to know that before I say anything else. George's breath caught audibly. Yale, let me finish, Yale said gently. Please. I know I am just a cowboy with more dreams than assets. I know I cannot offer you much right now, just hard work and uncertain prospects. But I am saving every penny I can, and I am learning everything I can about running a ranch properly. Someday, maybe in a year or two, I will have enough to make a down payment on some land. I want to build something real, something lasting, and I want to build it with you. Are you asking me to wait? George's voice was steady, but Yale could see her hands trembling. No, Yale said. I am asking you to marry me, not someday when I am more prosperous, but now, as soon as you are willing. I know it will mean more hard work, more uncertainty, more years of saving and struggling before we have the ranch I dream of. But we will face it together, and that will make all the difference. If you feel the same way I do, if you love me even a fraction as much as I love you, then say yes. Marry me, Georgia. Build a life with me. Tears streamed down Georgia's face, catching the dying light. You are absolutely certain? We have only known each other for 2 months. I am as certain of this as I am of my own name, Yale said. I know it defies logic. I know people will say we are being rash. But Georgia, I spent years being sensible, being cautious, never letting myself want anything too much for fear of losing it. Then you handed your food to a hungry man, and everything changed. You changed me, made me remember that life is for living, not just enduring. Georgia laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that made Yale's heart soar. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you, Yale Brennan. I love you too, have loved you almost from the beginning. You see me, really see me. Not just what I can do or what I should be, but who I actually am. How could I not love you for that? Yale pulled her into his arms, propriety forgotten, and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were soft and salt-sweet from tears, and the feel of her body against his was better than anything he had imagined during the long nights of wanting and waiting. She kissed him back with enthusiasm that matched his own, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a perfect moment, the entire world condensed down to just the two of them, together, complete. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the last of the sunset had faded to purple twilight, and the first stars were appearing overhead. We should go tell the Bennetts, Georgia said, her voice slightly dazed. They have been so good to us. They deserve to know. Tomorrow, Yale said, stealing another kiss. Tonight, I just want to hold you and let the reality settle in. You are going to be my wife, Georgia Sutton soon, to be Brennan. Georgia Brennan, she tested, then smiled. I like the sound of that. They walked back to the ranch buildings hand in hand. And if the other ranch hands noticed Yale's foolish grin or George's glowing face, they were kind enough not to comment. That night, Yale lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, sleep impossible despite his body's exhaustion. In his mind, he was planning their future with an intensity that would have seemed obsessive if it did not feel so right. They would marry quickly, he decided. No point in waiting when they were both certain. They would continue working at the Double B while saving aggressively, every penny not needed for absolute necessities going into the fund for their future ranch. In a year, maybe 2 at most, they would have enough for a down payment on some land. Nothing fancy at first, just enough acreage to run a modest herd. They would build a small house, nothing like the Bennetts' grand home, but solid and warm and theirs. They would work side by side, building something real and lasting. And someday, when they were established, there would be children, a whole houseful if Georgia was willing, filling their home with laughter and love. The future that had always seemed hazy and uncertain now snapped into sharp focus, and Yale could see it all as clearly as if it had already happened. He fell asleep with a smile on his face and Georgia's name on his lips. The Bennetts were delighted by the news, Mrs. Bennett actually crying happy tears as she hugged Georgia and declared that this was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Mr. Bennett shook Yale's hand with genuine warmth and offered to stand up with him at the wedding. The other ranch hands offered congratulations, ranging from sincere to ribald, but all good-natured. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Tonopah, the same church Georgia had been walking toward the day they met. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, attended by the Bennetts, the Double B Ranch hands, Mrs. Henderson from the restaurant, and a handful of other townspeople who had come to know and like the young couple. Georgia wore a dress borrowed from Mrs. Bennett, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and carried wildflowers that Yale had picked himself that morning. Yale wore his best clothes, brushed and pressed until they looked almost new, and tried not to shake as he spoke his vows. I, Yale Brennan, take you, Georgia Sutton, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, cherish you, and stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to work hard so we can build the life we both dream of. I promise to see you, always, exactly as you are, and love you all the more for it. This I swear, for as long as I live. Georgia's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I, Georgia Sutton, take you, Yale Brennan, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with everything I am, to support your dreams as you support mine, to build a life with you based on trust and respect and genuine partnership. I promise to remember that kindness matters, that generosity matters, that we are at our best when we help others as you helped me. This I swear, for as long as I live. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Yale kissed his bride, the small congregation erupted in applause. They celebrated with a reception at Mrs. Henderson's restaurant, the widow having refused payment for the meal, declaring it her wedding gift to the couple who had brought a bit of romance to her practical establishment. The Bennetts had given them an unexpected gift, a full week off work for a brief honeymoon. Yale used some of their carefully saved money to rent a small cabin near Lake Tahoe, a luxury that made Georgia gasp when she realized where they were going. The journey took 2 days by stage and horseback, but it delivered them to a place of breathtaking beauty that seemed worlds away from the dusty Nevada desert. The cabin was rustic but clean, nestled among pine trees with a view of the brilliant blue lake. They spent their week hiking through forests that smelled of pine and wildflowers, swimming in water so cold and clear it seemed unreal, and learning each other in the intimate ways of husband and wife. Yale had been with women before, brief encounters born of loneliness and opportunity rather than genuine connection. But nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming rightness of being with Georgia. She came to him without shame or artifice, and their lovemaking was by turns passionate and tender, playful and intense, always genuine. They talked for hours, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, planning their future in detail. Yale told Georgia about a piece of land he had seen once, years ago, in the foothills east of Tonopah. Good grass, reliable water from a spring-fed creek, sheltered valleys for winter grazing. It had been unoccupied then, possibly still was. If they could find out who owned it, make an offer, it could be the foundation of their ranch. Georgia talked about the kind of life she wanted to build, not just a successful ranch, but a real home. She wanted to foster education in whatever community they settled in, wanted to be the kind of neighbor people could rely on in hard times. She wanted children, several of them, raised with love and learning and the kind of security she had known before her parents' deaths. How many children? Yale asked, amused and touched by her vision of their future family. At least 3, Georgia said decisively. Maybe 4. I always wanted siblings when I was little, wanted a house full of noise and activity instead of being an only child. What about you? As many as you are willing to carry and raise, Yale said honestly. I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved, knowing they have a place in the world that no one can take away. I want them to have both parents who are present and engaged, not distant or distracted. I want to give them everything I did not have. We will, Georgia promised, kissing him softly. We will build that for them, for ourselves. It will take time and work, but we will get there. The week passed far too quickly, as precious times always do, and they returned to the Double B tanned and happy and more in love than ever. They settled into married life with surprising ease, occupying a small room in the bunkhouse that Mr. Bennett had converted for their use, giving them privacy while keeping Georgia close enough to help Mrs. Bennett as needed. Yale worked harder than ever, taking every opportunity for overtime and extra pay. He trained horses on the side for additional income, his skill with difficult animals becoming known throughout the area. Georgia continued managing the Bennett household while also taking in sewing and mending from other ranches, her stitches so fine, and even that she developed a reputation for quality work. Every penny they could save went into the tin box Yale kept hidden under their bed, their fund for the future growing with agonizing slowness, but growing nonetheless. Winter came to Nevada, not as harsh as winters further north, but cold enough to make the work harder. Yale spent long days in the saddle, checking on cattle dispersed across the winter range, breaking ice on water holes, searching for animals caught in arroyos or injured by predators. He came home each evening exhausted and half frozen. But Georgia was always there, with hot food and a warm bed, and a smile that made everything worthwhile. Spring brought calving season, weeks of intense work where Yale barely slept, constantly checking on expectant cows, assisting with difficult births, protecting vulnerable newborns from predators and weather. Georgia helped where she could, bringing food and coffee to the men working around the clock, sitting up with Yale on the long nights when he needed company more than sleep. One particularly difficult night, they lost a cow and nearly lost her calf as well, a breech birth that required all of Yale's skill and strength to resolve. He managed to save the baby, a spindly-legged bull calf that took several terrifying minutes to start breathing. When the calf finally staggered to its feet, bawling for the mother who would never answer, Yale felt tears running down his face, exhaustion and relief and sorrow all mixed together. Georgia was there, appearing out of the darkness with blankets and a bottle for the orphaned calf. She wrapped Yale in a blanket despite his protests that he was filthy, and she held him while he cried for the cow he could not save, for all the losses inherent in ranch life, for the hard reality that sometimes your best was not enough. "You saved the calf," Georgia said quietly. "That matters, Yale. That baby is alive because of you." "The cow should be alive too," Yale said bitterly. "I should have known sooner that something was wrong, should have been able to help her." "You are not God," Georgia said firmly. "You cannot control everything, cannot prevent every loss. But you can control your effort, your care, your willingness to try. That cow had the best chance possible because you were here. The calf is alive because you refused to give up. That is what matters." Her words cut through his emotional spiral, grounding him back in reality. Yale pulled his wife close and breathed in the scent of her hair, letting her steadiness anchor him. They sat together in the barn until dawn, taking turns feeding the orphaned calf, and by the time the sun rose, Yale had made his peace with the limits of his own power. The calf survived, adopted by a cow who had lost her own baby, and Yale took the animal's resilience as a sign that even the hardest beginnings could lead to good outcomes. Summer returned, and with it, Yale's 27th birthday. Georgia made him a cake, an extravagance given the cost of sugar and eggs, and presented him with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a good pen. "For planning," Georgia explained, "for writing down your thoughts about the ranch, your ideas for improvements, your dreams for the future. I know it is not much, but—" Yale kissed her, stopping the self-deprecating words. "It is perfect. You are perfect. Thank you." That night, he made the first entry in the journal, dating it July 15th, 1888. He wrote about his dreams for their ranch, the land he hoped to buy, the kind of operation he wanted to build. He wrote about Georgia, about how she had changed his life in ways he was still discovering. He wrote about his hope for the future, the family they would raise, the legacy they would leave. It became a habit, those journal entries, a way of processing his thoughts and tracking their progress toward the life they wanted. By autumn, they had saved nearly $400, a substantial sum that represented over a year of brutal economizing and extra work. Yale made inquiries about the land he remembered, discovered it was owned by an aging prospector who had never developed it and might be willing to sell. With Mr. Bennett's permission and recommendation, Yale and Georgia traveled to Carson City to meet with the prospector and discuss terms. The prospector was a wizened man named Eli who smelled of whiskey and tobacco, but his eyes were sharp and he drove a hard bargain. The land Yale wanted encompassed nearly 600 acres, including the spring-fed creek and several natural meadows. Eli wanted $800 for it, more than Yale and Georgia had, but he was willing to accept $400 down and monthly payments on the remainder at reasonable interest. Yale and Georgia looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in that glance. This was what they had been working toward, but committing to debt meant risk. If anything went wrong, if the ranch failed, they could lose everything. "We will take it," Yale said, and Georgia squeezed his hand in agreement. They signed the papers, paid the down payment, and walked out of the land office as property owners, dizzy with the magnitude of what they had just done. That night, in a hotel room they could not quite afford, they made love with desperate intensity, celebrating and seeking reassurance in equal measure. "We can do this," Georgia whispered afterward, her head on Yale's chest. "I know we can." "We will," Yale promised, "whatever it takes." They returned to the Double B and gave their notice, though they agreed to stay on until the Bennetts could find replacements. Mr. Bennett was sorry to lose them, but generous in his understanding, even offering to loan them some breeding stock to help them get started. Over the next 2 months, Yale and Georgia prepared for their new life, purchasing supplies and equipment, making connections with buyers and suppliers, learning everything they could about running an independent operation. In November 1888, they moved onto their land, into a house that was little more than a cabin, 2 rooms and a loft with a stone fireplace and windows that let in almost as much wind as light. It was rough and primitive, and the most beautiful thing Yale had ever seen, because it was theirs, paid for with their own sweat and sacrifice, the foundation of the future they were building together. That first winter was brutally hard. They were learning as they went, making mistakes and paying for them, discovering that ownership brought responsibilities they had not fully anticipated. Their small herd, 20 cows and a bull borrowed from Mr. Bennett, required constant attention. Water lines froze, wolves tested their defenses, a late blizzard caught them unprepared and cost them 2 calves. But they persevered, Yale and Georgia working side by side from dawn until long after dark, doing everything that needed doing with their own 4 hands. Slowly, they learned the rhythms of their land, the patterns of weather and wildlife, the 100 small tricks that made the difference between success and failure. Spring brought new challenges and new hope. The surviving calves grew strong and healthy, and Georgia announced that she was pregnant, due in late autumn. Yale's joy was tempered by fear, knowing how many women died in childbirth, knowing how far they were from town and medical help. But Georgia was strong and healthy, and they had months to prepare. Through the summer, as Georgia's belly swelled with their child, Yale worked with frantic energy, improving their house, expanding their herd, building up reserves against the lean times that would inevitably come. He built furniture for the baby, a cradle from pine logs and a changing table from scrap lumber, his rough carpenter's skills creating pieces that were sturdy, if not elegant. Georgia sewed baby clothes from fabric, purchased with precious saved dollars, every tiny garment receiving her finest stitches. In October 1889, with the help of a midwife from Tonopah and Mrs. Bennett, who traveled out despite her own young children, Georgia gave birth to their first child, a son they named Wyatt after no one in particular, simply because they liked the name. Yale held his son for the first time with hands that trembled, looking down at the tiny red face and feeling his entire world shift on its axis. This was what mattered, he thought, not the land or the cattle or any material measure of success. This child, this family, this love. Everything else was just details. Georgia recovered quickly from the birth, her natural strength and determination serving her well. She returned to work within weeks, the baby strapped to her back in a sling she had fashioned, doing everything that needed doing while simultaneously caring for an infant. Yale marveled at her resilience, at the way motherhood had somehow made her even more beautiful, despite the exhaustion and additional work. Their second year on the ranch was easier than the first, the learning curve less steep, their systems and routines more established. They expanded their herd, adding horses to the cattle, finding that Yale's skill at training created a profitable sideline. Word spread about the quality of his work, and people began bringing difficult horses from miles around, paying good money for Yale to work his patient magic. In the spring of 1891, Georgia announced another pregnancy, and that autumn she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. The little girl had Georgia's honey-colored hair and Yale's brown eyes, a perfect combination of both parents. Wyatt, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, his chubby toddler hands surprisingly gentle as he touched her tiny fingers. The years rolled by in a pattern of work and growth, challenges and triumphs. A third child came in 1893, another daughter named Rose, a fourth in 1895, a son named James. Their cabin expanded room by room as Yale built additions whenever time and money allowed, the house growing with their family. Their herd increased, not dramatically but steadily, and their reputation for quality cattle and well-trained horses spread throughout Nevada. They made friends with their neighbors, the scattered ranchers and miners who populated the area. They helped others in times of need and accepted help when they needed it, building the kind of community Georgia had envisioned. They donated money to establish a small school in the growing town of Silver Springs, ensuring that their children and others in the area would have access to education. Life was not easy. There were droughts and disease, years when the market for cattle collapsed and they struggled to make ends meet, times when Yale wondered if they would lose everything. But they held on, sometimes by their fingernails, and every challenge survived made them stronger. In 1900, on a warm summer evening, Yale and Georgia sat on the porch of their much-expanded house, watching their 4 children play in the yard as the sun set in its familiar spectacular fashion. Wyatt, now 11, was teaching 9-year-old Grace to rope using a fence post as a target. Rose, 7, was picking wildflowers with the focused intensity she brought to everything. James, 5, was running in circles for no apparent reason other than the joy of movement. "Can you believe it has been almost 13 years since we met?" Georgia asked, her hand finding Yale's as naturally as breathing. "Since you saw me give away my lunch and decided to change my life?" "Our lives," Yale corrected. "You changed mine just as much. More, probably. I was just drifting before you, Georgia, going through the motions without any real purpose or direction. You gave me a reason to stop, to stay, to build something real." "We built it together," Georgia said. "This ranch, this family, this life. All of it, together." Yale looked at his wife, at the silver threads beginning to show in her honey-colored hair, at the fine lines around her eyes earned through years of squinting into the sun and laughing at their children's antics. She was 40 years old now, he was 39, and they were both worn by hard work and hard years. But to Yale, Georgia was more beautiful than ever. The girl he had fallen in love with somehow transformed into this extraordinary woman who had walked beside him through everything. "Do you regret it?" Yale asked. "Marrying so quickly, taking such a risk on a cowboy with nothing but dreams?" Georgia turned to him, her sage green eyes still as clear and direct as they had been that first day in Tonopah. "Not for a single moment. You saw me, Yale. Really saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You offered me food, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me yourself, your dreams, your future. You made me a partner rather than a dependent. How could I possibly regret that?" Yale kissed her, there on the porch with their children playing nearby, and poured 13 years of love into it. When they broke apart, all 4 children were watching with expressions ranging from disgust to amusement. "Mama and Papa are being mushy again," James announced to his siblings. "They are always mushy," Wyatt said with the worldly wisdom of 11 years. "You get used to it?" Yale and Georgia laughed, and the sound carried across the ranch they had built together, across the land they owned free and clear after years of payments and sacrifice, across the life they had created through love and work and stubborn determination to build something lasting. More years passed, bringing more changes and challenges. Wyatt grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did and showed every sign of becoming an excellent cattleman. Grace revealed a passion for horses that exceeded even Yale's, her intuitive understanding of the animals' minds making her invaluable in the training operation. Rose discovered she had inherited her mother's love of teaching and began helping at the school in Silver Springs. James remained the wild child, always exploring, always asking questions, always pushing boundaries in ways that terrified and delighted his parents in equal measure. Yale's hair went completely gray by the time he turned 50, and his body carried the accumulated aches and pains of decades of hard physical labor. But he still rose every morning before dawn, still spent his days working the land he loved, still found joy in the simple satisfaction of a job done well. Georgia's hands showed the effects of years of cooking and cleaning and sewing and all the countless tasks that ranch life demanded. But she remained strong and capable, the heart of their family and the foundation Yale built his life upon. In 1905, Wyatt married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over, a practical young woman named Sarah, who fit into the Brennan family as if she had always belonged. Yale and Georgia gained a daughter-in-law and, in time, grandchildren, two boys who ran around the ranch the way their father had once done. The house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, rooms added for Wyatt and Sarah and their babies. Grace fell in love with a horse trainer from California, a good man who respected her skills and wanted to partner with her in business as well as life. They married in 1907 and established their own operation near Sacramento, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to be their own entity. Yale and Georgia attended the wedding and spent a week in California, marveling at the green lushness so different from their Nevada desert. Rose earned her teaching certificate and accepted a position at a school in Reno, writing long letters home filled with stories about her students and the growing city. She married a lawyer in 1910, a bookish man who adored her passion for education and supported her work in ways that made Georgia cry happy tears at the wedding. James proved to be the family wanderer, unable to settle in one place the way his siblings did. He tried his hand at ranching, mining, even professional baseball for a brief stint, before injuries ended that dream. But he always came home eventually, staying long enough to reconnect with his family before the restless urge to see what was over the next horizon drove him away again. Yale understood that wandering impulse, remembered being that young man who could not stay still, and he never pressured James to be anything other than who he was. In 1912, Yale and Georgia celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a party that drew people from all over Nevada. The ranch had become a fixture in the community, known for fair dealing and quality stock. Yale had served on the town council in Silver Springs, had helped establish churches and schools and all the infrastructure that transformed scattered homesteads into real communities. Georgia had taught reading to anyone who asked, had nursed sick neighbors through influenza and injuries, had made herself indispensable to everyone who knew her. At the party, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, someone asked Yale the secret to a successful marriage and a successful ranch. Yale looked at Georgia, his wife of 25 years, the woman who had taken a chance on a cowboy with nothing but dreams, and his answer came easily. Find someone who shares your values, Yale said. Someone who will work beside you rather than behind you. Someone who gives away their food to feed the hungry, even when they have nothing to spare. That is the kind of person who will stand with you through anything. And once you find them, never let them go. Never stop seeing them the way you saw them that first day. Never take for granted the gift of their presence in your life. Georgia's eyes filled with tears, and she kissed Yale in front of everyone, propriety forgotten in the face of genuine emotion. The years continued their relentless march, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure. Yale's old friend Tom Crawford died in 1915, kicked by a horse he had been shoeing. They attended the funeral and mourned the man who had helped them start their life together. Mrs. Bennett passed in 1918, the influenza epidemic taking her before her 60th birthday. Mr. Bennett followed 2 years later, grief-stricken without his wife. But there were joys too. More grandchildren, healthy and happy, and growing up on the land their grandparents had carved from wilderness. The ranch continued to prosper, weathering economic downturns and dry years, always surviving, always adapting. Yale passed the day-to-day operations to Wyatt in 1920, though he remained active in an advisory capacity, unable to fully step away from the work that had defined his adult life. On a summer evening in 1925, Yale and Georgia sat in the same spot where they had sat so many times before, on the porch of their house watching the sunset. Yale was 64 years old, Georgia 62, and they had been married for 37 years. Yale's hair was white now, his face deeply lined, his body moving slowly thanks to arthritis and old injuries. Georgia's hands were gnarled with age, her vision failing despite glasses, her once honey hair gone completely silver. But when Yale looked at his wife, he still saw the young woman who had given away her food to a hungry prospector, still felt the same leap of his heart that he had felt that day in Tonopah. And when Georgia looked at Yale, she still saw the cowboy who had stopped her on a dusty street and said, "Now let me feed you," the man who had seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. "I love you," Yale said, as he had said countless times over the past 37 years. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Georgia replied, her hand finding his with the ease of long practice. "You gave me everything, Yale. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other everything," Yale corrected gently. "That is how partnership works. Equal give and take, both contributing, both receiving. That is what we built here, Georgia. Not just a ranch, not just a family, but a real partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in the same spectacular colors it had shown them for decades. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of family, grandchildren laughing, Wyatt and Sarah discussing the next day's work. The land stretched out before them, the ranch they had built from nothing but dreams and determination, the legacy they would leave to their children and grandchildren. "Do you remember that day in Tonopah?" Georgia asked, "when you saw me give away my lunch?" "Every detail," Yale confirmed. "The way the sun was beating down, the dust in the air, the way you smiled at that old prospector like he was someone who mattered, the way you walked away with your hand on your stomach, trying to hide your hunger. I knew in that moment that I had seen something rare, someone whose compassion exceeded their own needs. I knew I had to know you better. I remember thinking you were either very kind or very foolish," Georgia admitted with a soft laugh, "offering to feed a stranger, insisting when I tried to refuse. But there was something about you, even then, something honest and good that made me want to trust you despite all my instincts towards self-preservation." "Best decision you ever made?" Yale teased. "Best decision we both made," Georgia said. "You decided to see me. I decided to be seen. And everything that came after all of this flowed from those two simple decisions." Yale pulled his wife close, feeling the familiar comfort of her body against his, the warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch or a large family, but a genuine partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. As the stars began appearing overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding night so many years ago, Yale and Georgia Brennan sat together in perfect contentment. Two people who had found each other against all odds and had chosen each other every day since. The ranch would continue after they were gone, passed down through generations of Brennans who would work the land and raise their families here. But the true legacy was not the land or the cattle or the buildings. The true legacy was love, the kind that saw past surfaces to souls, the kind that gave generously even when resources were scarce, the kind that built something lasting from the simple foundation of genuine compassion and mutual respect. Yale and Georgia lived many more years together, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had helped build. When Yale passed away in 1932, at the age of 71, he died in his own bed, in the house he had built with his own hands, holding the hand of the woman he had loved for 45 years. Georgia followed him 3 years later, her heart simply stopping in her sleep, as if she had decided that life without Yale was not worth continuing. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, the land they had transformed from empty desert into something productive and beautiful. Their gravestone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line Yale had written in his journal years ago and insisted be included. They saw each other, truly, and built a life on that seeing. The ranch continued through the generations, Brennans working the land their great-great-grandparents had claimed. The story of how Yale and Georgia met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tin box Yale had kept under their bed, the one where they saved for their future, became a family heirloom passed down along with the story of sacrifice and determination it represented. But the real legacy lived on in less tangible ways. In the value the family placed on education, honoring Georgia's passion for learning, in the way they treated their workers with respect and fairness, following Yale's example, in the generosity they showed to those in need, remembering the hungry prospector and Georgia's selfless compassion, in the partnerships they built in their own marriages, striving for the equal respect and genuine love that had characterized Yale and Georgia's relationship. The Brennan Ranch became one of the most respected operations in Nevada, not because it was the biggest or the wealthiest, but because it was built on a foundation of integrity and love that never wavered across generations. And on summer evenings, when the light was right and the wind carried whispers across the land, people swore they could feel the presence of Yale and Georgia still watching over the place they had built together, still holding hands, still seeing each other with the same clarity and love that had defined their remarkable life together. Their story became more than family legend. It became a testament to the power of a single act of compassion witnessed and acknowledged. Georgia had given her food away, not knowing anyone was watching. Yale had watched and had chosen to act on what he saw. From that simple beginning, from one man saying, "Now let me feed you," to a woman who had given away her last meal, an entire legacy had grown. It was a reminder that our smallest actions have ripples we cannot predict, that kindness begets kindness, that love can grow from the most unlikely soil if tended with care and commitment. The Wild West of 1887 was a hard place, a landscape that tested everyone who tried to make a life there. But it was also a place where two people could meet by chance and choose each other against all odds, where a cowboy and a schoolteacher could build something lasting from nothing but dreams and determination, where love could bloom in the desert and endure through decades of challenges, where the simple act of feeding someone hungry could become the foundation of a life worth living, a family worth raising, a legacy worth leaving. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the land or the cattle or any material measure of success, but the love that grew between two people who saw each other truly and chose each other completely. Yale and Georgia Brennan lived long lives filled with hard work and genuine joy, with struggles overcome and dreams achieved. They raised children who continued the work they started. They built something that lasted, not just in physical terms, but in the values they embodied and passed down. And it all began on a dusty street in Tonopah, Nevada, when a hungry woman gave away her food and a cowboy with observant eyes decided that such kindness deserved to be fed, nurtured, cherished. When Yale Brennan said, "Now let me feed you," to Georgia Sutton, he was offering more than a meal. He was offering himself, his future, his heart. And when Georgia accepted, she was agreeing to more than dinner. She was agreeing to build a life together, to face whatever came side by side, to love and be loved, with the kind of depth and commitment that transforms two individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and burial and the passage of time. But their love never ended. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that bore their name, in the community they had helped build, in every person who heard their story and chose to see the people around them a little more clearly, to act on compassion a little more readily, to build their own lives on the foundation of genuine love and mutual respect. Yale and Georgia Brennan were not perfect people. They made mistakes, faced failures, struggled with all the challenges that come with building a life in an unforgiving landscape, but they loved each other with consistency and commitment, and that love made everything else possible. It was a love that started with food shared and grew into a legacy that would outlast them both. A reminder that the best things in life often begin with the simplest acts of kindness, offered freely and accepted gratefully.